Okay, we're ready to begin experiment number 2. Now, before we actually set up our test tubes, we need to prepare a couple of things. In this particular experiment, we're going to be doing a reaction between a substrate, pyrogallol, and an enzyme, tyrosinase. It ends up that tyrosinase is actually present in potatoes. So the first thing I'm going to do is take this potato, which has been nicely chopped up, and I'm going to add it into my blender along with 50 milliliters of water. Just as we did with the pineapple juice, we're going to be able to make a nice potato juice here. It's one of my favorites. And just as we did before, we're going to strain this through cheesecloth. It's going to be a little bit chunky. And I should have the opportunity to again squeeze some juice out of this to make sure that I have enough. All right, and that should do. I do also have to prepare the pyrogallol. So that is here, and it is in a powdered form. I'm going to add 20 milliliters of water to this. And I will shake that up. Now we have all the supplies we need. All we have to do is set up our test tubes and get started on the experiment. Okay, let's jump into our enzyme experiment on page 128 and 129. The first thing we want to do is talk about this particular experiment. So in our experiment, we're dealing with a substrate we refer to as pyrogallol, and in the presence of an enzyme, tyrosinase, which we find in our potato juice, we're potentially going to form cyclic polyketone, which we're going to recognize by its yellow color. So a general enzymatic reaction needs the functional enzyme to be able to facilitate the reaction and result in whatever product we're going to see. In our particular case, we can see that we have 5 tubes, and we are going to be adding different substances to each of them. As we go through this, we want to make sure that we prepare predictions about what we think is going to happen as a result of what we are adding to each tube. So why don't we go ahead and take a look at the tubes over here. We have 5 labeled tubes out here. I can go ahead and figure out what we need to stick into each one of them. So in the case of tube number 1, I'm going to add 5 drops of our potato juice. So I'm just going to pick some of that up, and I'm going to add 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 drops of potato juice to test tube number 1. In the case of test tube number 2, I'm going to add pyrogallol. So as we're doing this, think about what pyrogallol is. This is our substrate. And in this case, that is all I'm adding to that tube. Now, as we think about this, I'm going to go to tube number 3 here, and I'm going to add 5 drops of each of these. Now, according to these instructions, I also need to add some water to each of these tubes. And so I'm going to be adding water. And I'm going to need 4 milliliters. In tube number 1. I'll need 4 milliliters of water also in tube number 2. And because I have a little bit more in tube number 3, I'm just going to add 3.5 milliliters. Now, we do recognize that tubes 4 and 5 are a little bit different. So I'm going to go ahead and add the water into each of those right now. I have 3 milliliters going into tube number 4. And in tube number 5, I'm going to have 3.5 milliliters. All right, now here's where things get tricky and we have to make sure that we follow instructions correctly. So as we are taking a look here, it says that for test tube number 4, I'm going to mix the water, the potato extract, and the PTU, which is going to be an enzyme inhibitor, for 30 seconds. Only after I do that will I add 5 drops of pyrogallol. So what I'm going to go ahead and do at this point is add my potato extract. Got my 5 drops there. I'm going to shake up and add my PTU, another 5 drops of that. Now, since that is an enzyme inhibitor, I want to give it time to interact with my enzyme prior to adding the substrate. So we'll let that sit for 30 seconds. For test tube number 5, I can find down here in step number 6, mix DI water and potato extract and heat for 10 minutes. So what I'm going to do right now is make sure I get that potato extract in here. And I'm going to place that in a dry bath to heat that, and we'll come back and check on that later.